here with our first lecture, little video on Vergil's Aeneid. This week we're just going to cover book one because my expectation is to still working on your internal assessments. But next week we'll move on to do two books that week, books 2 and 3. So we will have you do more reading next week with the understanding that the internal assessment should be mostly wrapped up. So, two takeaways from this video. The first is an understanding of how and why Vergil introduces elements from his immediate context into the Aeneid. And we're going to specifically look at lines 307 to 359 of Book 1, The Prophecy of Jupiter. And then an understanding of how using comparative analysis between Homer's Odyssey, and I'm going to quote the Odyssey here, so even if you haven't read the Odyssey yet, that's fine, and Vergil's Aeneid help us identify and understand better Vergil's major concerns, themes, and trajectories. We're going to specifically look at lines 211 through 227 of Book 1. So I know it says Aeneid 1 through 4 down there. We're really just going to do the first book today. So, where does Vergil's Aeneid begin? Well, the Trojan War has been lost, and we'll see some detail about that in Book 2. Aeneas has taken what survivors there are and fled from Troy because of a prophecy that they will found a new Trojan nation somewhere else. Ultimately, we'll find out, of course, it's in Italy and it's Rome. So in a way, this is also like the Odyssey, a sequel to the Iliad. But it's from the Trojan perspective, because Aeneas is one of the leading Trojans, which you can see in the Iliad. He is a character there too. And even in Homer's Iliad, Poseidon at one point says, the house of Priam will fall, and Aeneas will then rule over the Trojans. Now, Homer, of course, didn't know about Rome or even really Italy. But there has been a long mythological tradition, even before Vergil, that Aeneas would rule over the survivors of the Trojan War on the Trojan side. It picks up, as you may have read by now, Aeneas is at sea and suffering a storm brought on by the goddess Juno, or Hera in Greek. Even in the Iliad, she still hates the Trojans because of the judgment of Paris, where Paris said that Venus was the most beautiful goddess between her and Juno and Minerva, because Venus promised Paris that he could marry Helen. And Venus, besides being kind of that cause of the Trojan War, one of them, is also the mother of Aeneas. So our Aeneas, our hero, is half divine, because his mother is Venus, and half human. His father is Anchises, as one of the characters in the epic. And if you've looked at the heroic cult video from last week as a sort of background to this, you can see that Aeneas too is worshipped at least as a hero after his death, in some cases even as a divinity called Jupiter Indige. So he's an aspect of Jupiter, the king of the gods, another character in our poem. So, why is the goddess Juno so angry at Aeneas and his people? Well, I've given you the Homeric answer, the judgment of Paris. But we see in the opening of the Aeneid, there is also a Roman answer, that Juno favors the Carthaginians, or the great enemy of the Romans, especially with Hannibal in the Second Punic War. And since she wants the Carthaginians to have the empire and not the Romans, she especially doesn't like Aeneas, knowing that the Roman race will ultimately be descended from him and his offspring. She had heard that a scion of Trojan blood would someday level Carthage's citadel, that a Trojan people in imperial power would destroy Libya. So the Parcae were spinning out fate. The Parcae are the Fates. So this is from the first book, lines 26 through 30. The narrator's referencing, as I said, the Punic Wars. There were 3 of them. First one from 264 to 240. The next from 218 to 201 BC. That's the one with Hannibal. and then from 149 to 146 BC, the Third Punic War, where Rome ultimately leveled Carthage completely. I've said before, Juno wanted them to have the big Mediterranean empire. And Carthage was a rival naval power. In fact, the Romans only developed a navy to fight Carthage in the First Punic War. But by the end of these three Punic Wars, Carthage is no more, and Rome is victorious and dominates the entire Mediterranean. Because at the same time it leveled Carthage in 146 in the west, in the eastern part of the Mediterranean in Greece, it also completely leveled the city of Corinth. There are some historians think that Rome arranged to do this almost simultaneously, or as close as you could get in the ancient world, to make a point that they ran the show completely now in the Mediterranean. So the big take-home is that from the beginning of the text, or close to it, Vergil's Aeneid connects the events of its narrative in mythical time, the Trojan War, Aeneas, the gods, to events in later Roman history. Aeneas, after all, will ultimately set things in motion for the foundation of the city of Rome. And it's important to note here that a key relation between Roman epic and Roman history is that Roman epic is still telling Roman history, even if it's in the far, far past. But it's bringing the gods and the divine into the mix, which of course you don't see in, for example, Caesar or Livy. And so it's taking Roman history and putting it on that cosmic level that distinguishes Roman epic from Greek epic. And I brought up the example of Caesar, not just because we've been reading him this year, but Cicero was trying to write an epic poem about Caesar's expedition to Britain, that as far as we know, he never really did much with. So now let's move on to lines 307 to 359. After the great storm, Venus is very upset. She thinks that everything's ruined for Aeneas. There'll be no Rome. So she goes to her father Jupiter to question him. Why are you letting this happen? And Jupiter unrolls the scroll of fate and gives the first of several prophecies about Roman history. We'll see another one in Book 6 and another one in Book 8. This is one of the most important passages in Book 1, and indeed of the entire poem. So we're going to spend some real time with this. Jupiter starts out, "Spare your fears, Cytherean," that's just another name for Venus. "Your people's destiny remains unmoved." He's talking about the Romans. "You will see Lavinium in its promised walls, and you will raise great-souled Aeneas to the stars on high. I have not changed my mind. Your son, I will speak at length, since you are so worried, unrolling fate's scroll and revealing its secrets. Your son, Aeneas, will wage a great war in Italy, crush barbarous nations, and set up laws and city walls for his own people, reigning in Latium until 3 summers have passed, and 3 winters since the Rutulians' defeat. But the boy Ascanius, surnamed Iulus, his name was Iulus while Ilium still stood, so it sounds like Troy. He will be in power for 30 great cycles of the rolling months, will move his throne from Lavinium, and build the mighty walls of Alba Longa. This kingdom will endure for 300 years under Hector's race, until Ilia, Vestal's royal priestess, pregnant by Mars, shall give birth to twins. Then Romulus, proud in the tawny hide of the wolf who nursed him, will continue the lineage, build the walls of Mars, and call the people after his own name, Romans. For I set no limits in time or space, and have given to them eternal empire, world without end." So, we've now seen 2 intrusions of history into the mythical time of Vergil's Aeneid. First, the reference to Carthage's defeat, and now this whole speech, which we just went through. And it also brings us the connection to the Emperor Augustus, who sort of commissioned this poem and ensured that it would be published, because Vergil wanted it destroyed on his deathbed. So from Venus, you have Aeneas, his son Ascanius, and Iulus, and you can see from that other name that he's the founder of the Julian family, which over the centuries gets us to Julius Caesar and then Augustus. Aeneid 2 will also have a reference to Augustus with the portent of Ascanius. That's lines 800 to 810, but we'll get to that in a little bit. So the Augustan question, we could frame it this way. The connection between Rome's history, its successes, its empire, and ultimately Augustus are made obvious as early as halfway through the first book of the Aeneid in Jupiter's speech to Venus. The obvious extension of those connections is the question, how will Vergil treat the figure of Augustus in the Aeneid? And this is the big question about Vergil's Aeneid. The way scholars sometimes put it, is Vergil pro or anti-Augustus? It's a complex question. I tend to veer more on the anti-Augustus, or at least very ambivalent about Augustus, and that will become clear as we go through all of these slides. And I'm basing a lot of this on what I think is the best book on Vergil's Aeneid by a guy named Ralph Johnson called Darkness Visible. And we'll come to that. We'll see that book again a little bit later. So let's talk about Aeneas. It's about time. It's his poem. It's named after him, after all. So on the following slides, I'm going to show you a quotation from Vergil's Aeneid 1. The passage is one of the first extended descriptions of an action undertaken by the text's main character, Aeneas. It's after the storm. As I read the passage aloud, consider how you would describe the character who's being depicted here. What distinguishes the characters in other texts that we've read? So, for example, how is he different as a leader from Julius Caesar? Aeneas now climbed up to an isolated point, with a view of the sea spread out below, hoping to see where the storm might have left, the Phrygian galleys of Antheus or of Capys, or to glean Caicus's armor, mounted high on the stern. There was no ship in sight. But he did see 3 stags browsing on the shore, and behind them an entire herd, feeding in a long line down through the valley. Aeneas stood still, as did faithful Achates, who passed over feathered arrows and a bow. He brought down the leaders, each standing tall, with a thicket of antlers. And then he shot at the herd itself, scattering them with his arrows into the woods. He did not stop shooting until he had triumphantly brought down 7 good-sized animals, 1 for each ship. Back at the port, Aeneas distributed the meat among all of his men and distributed wine. So, how would you describe the character being here depicted? And what distinguishes him from the characters in other texts that we've read? Now, again, our first thought might be Julius Caesar. You might also, if you've read and looked at the video, think about Gilgamesh as well. So here you might just want to pause the video for a second to kind of think this out, and then we'll move on. So we got 3 issues that we can discuss, and maybe these are the 3 or among the some that you came up with. First, Aeneas's vision. Aeneas now climbed up to an isolated point, with a view of the sea spread out below. And then this transitions into thinking about the loss of his friends. He was hoping to see where the storm might have left the Phrygian galleys of Antheus or Capys or Caicus, but there was no ship in sight. But then he still thinks of the needs of his people, those who have survived. He sees the stags, and then the entire herd. He thinks back to when he played Breath of the Wild and gets that bow ready. And so the vision transfers from one of mourning to one of taking care of his people in hunting. So now he's gone from looking at the sea to a long line down through the valley. The Latin for that is et longum per vallis pascitor augmen. So you've got hyperbaton here between longum and augmen, and the augmen here, when it's talking about people, is talking about a military formation, so we'll see that in Book 12. But here it's talking about a herd of deer, thought of as a military formation, which is appropriate because he's going to feed his soldiers, his men, with this venison. So to compare this, let's take a look back to Homer. Now the major reason to do that is because the Aeneid is very much modeled on the Homeric poems. The first half, books 1 through 6, is a lot like the Odyssey, and the second half, 7 through 12, is very much like the Iliad. Now I'm not going to presume that you've read any Homer before going through this, and I've said we might end up reading the Odyssey afterwards, because I think you get everything you need from Homer for our purposes. We just read the Odyssey. But both texts, remember, are fully on Google Classroom with study guides and some other PowerPoints. So our context here is in Book 10 of the Odyssey. Odysseus is trying to journey back from Troy with his men, kind of like Aeneas, and they are on one of their stops, which turns out to not be quite safe for them. So in the following slides, I'm going to give you a quotation from Homer's Odyssey, Book 10. This passage shares a number of clear parallels with what we just talked about in Vergil's Aeneid. Now, as I read this aloud, what I'd like you to think about is some major differences between how each author chooses to depict their respective scene. So now we turn to Homer. But when dawn combed her hair in the third day's light, I took my sword and spear and went up from the ship to open ground, hoping to see plowed fields and to hear human voices. So I climbed to a rugged lookout point and surveyed the scene. What I saw was smoke rising up from Circe's house. It curled up high through the thick brush and woods, and I wondered whether I should go and have a closer look. But I decided it was better to go back to the ship and give my crew their meal, and then send out a party to reconnoiter. I was on my way back and close to the ship when some god took pity on me, walking there alone, and sent a great antlered stag right into my path. He was on his way, down to the river from his pasture in the woods, thirsty and hot from the sun beating down. And as he came out, I got him right in the spine, in the middle of his back. The bronze spear bored all the way through, and he fell in the dust with a groan, and his spirit flew away. Planting my foot on him, I drew the bronze spear out of the wound and laid it down on the ground. Then I pulled up a bunch of willow shoots and twisted them together to make a rope about a fathom long. I used this to tie the stag's feet together so I could carry him across my back, leaning on my spear as I went back to the ship. There was no way an animal that large could be held on one shoulder. I flung him down by the ship and roused my men. This is from Book 10, lines 160 to 191 of the Odyssey. So again, maybe pause the video for a second and think about what are the differences between how Vergil portrayed Aeneas hunting the stag in that context, and then what Homer has done with Odysseus here. One thing to point out is Odysseus is alone. He doesn't have any buddies with him, unlike Aeneas. So we got two different hunts, both involving stags. So one difference, here we have a plausible narrative, and Vergil's narrative is somewhat implausible. Think about why that might be so, if we went back for a few moments. Now he's got the stags browsing on the shore in a long line through the valley. He brought down 7 animals, one for each ship. That's convenient. And he brings them all back, 7, about 2 people, him and Achates. Whereas Odysseus is quick to point out he could barely get 1 back. So there's one way it might be a bit implausible. Homer's version is interested in realism. Think about the detail he gives about Odysseus spearing the stag, and the detail he gives about how he ties it up to carry it back. But Vergil overlooks all that stuff. He's more interested in the mood, mourning his lost companions, to caring for the survivors, and the psychological explanation behind that. The critic Brooks Otis, in his book, Vergil, A Study in Civilized Poetry, defined this as the objective view of Homer versus the subjective view of Vergil. Vergil is much more interested in psychology than Homer is. Not to say that Homer isn't. And certainly we can talk about a psychology of Achilles, for example, but it is much more one of Vergil's concerns. The other difference is, in Homer, it's part of the epic where Odysseus is narrating his own adventures, books 9 through 12 of the Odyssey. But in Vergil's version, it's the omniscient narrator. Aeneas will narrate part of his own adventures, but that's only books 2 and 3. We haven't gotten to that point yet. So what's the take-home? Vergil does not exclude order and design from his narratives or from his imagined worlds, but he does sacrifice a maximum of clarity and harmony in order to accommodate the priorities that interest him most: the complexities of history, the secret springs of human behavior and human destiny. What Vergil has to imagine is, essentially, unknown and probably unknowable. This means that the Homeric norm, in the forms that it calls into being, though Vergil can and does make use of them frequently, must often be sacrificed in favor of both of the extreme modes that they mediate between, in favor of the exalted reifications of history and fate, which Homer would not understand. Not a lot of prophecy in Homer, certainly not like there is in the Aeneid, and which he would doubtless scorn if he could understand them, and in favor, on Vergil's part, of a rich yet radically disordered complexity of impression, evocation, wild emotion, and incantation. That might seem like some heady stuff, but I told you we'd return to this from Ralph Johnson's Darkness Visible, which is from page 47 of that book, these past 2 slides. So our take-home, in short, it seems from an analysis of these 2 passages that the anxieties that Vergil seeks to treat. Why am I saying anxieties? Well, he is writing this after Rome has suffered about a full century of civil war. The anxieties that Vergil seeks to treat in composing his Aeneid could not have been dealt with sufficiently using Homer's realism. As we read, we'll explore further the ways in which Vergil constructs his radically disordered complexity, and we'll make interpretations on what concerns he might be trying to address through this complexity. So, that's it for Vergil's Aeneid, Book 1. If you've got questions on this after the study guide and after going through this PowerPoint video, make sure you bring those to one of our Google Meet sessions on Monday, Wednesday, or Friday, or even, of course, just email me anytime. I hope that you'll like the Aeneid. I suspect you'll like the Odyssey better. A lot of people do. But I hope I can communicate to you guys over the course of the next couple of months how much there is to take away from the Aeneid, especially about history, so we can tie it back to Caesar. It's one of the reasons I chose to do them together. And also what we can take from Homer's Odyssey. Have a great week, guys, and we'll see you on Google Meet.